In 2018, a geneticist in Padua, Italy, did something almost nobody had tried before. She took nearly invisible dust caught in the weave of the world's most famous burial cloth, and she ran it through a DNA sequencer. She expected maybe 1 or 2 genetic signatures. What came back were traces of people from the Middle East, Europe, the Caucasus, and even parts of Asia, all tangled together in the same fibers. Her name is Gianna Barcaccia, and by her own account, she checked the results more than once because she didn't quite believe what she was looking at. The cloth is the Shroud of Turin, the length of linen many believe once wrapped the body of Jesus of Nazareth. And the DNA findings didn't answer the question everyone wanted answered. They opened up a much stranger one. Because if this cloth really did originate in one place with one body, why does its DNA read like a passenger list from a dozen different countries? Keep watching, because the answer to that question says less about a miracle and more about something almost nobody expects. And it's going to change how you think about the object entirely. If you've heard of the Shroud of Turin before, you've probably heard the popular version of its story. Just how unusual this situation 14-foot really linen is when you compare it to almost any other population on image of a bearded man. Most groups of people who share a culture also share a continuous piece of land. Believers live near each other for centuries. They marry within a reasonable radius. Their history, for the most part, briefly unfolds in one place or in a slow connected march across neighboring regions. It's easy to understand why the myth is not what happened here. The image really is strange. Picture a family in the highlands of Yemen, keeping under microscopes, the coloring from the same ancient text, the very top fibers of the cloth, not soaked in like thousands of miles dye. For centuries, nobody could fully explain how it got there. Would have needed months of travel just to reach them. A simple explanation. Now add a third family in the most powerful one available, a fourth, and for millions of believers, a fifth. That explanation was a miracle. And a sixth. There's also a reason this myth has lasted so long. None of these communities were in regular contact. Instead of brushing many hadn't seen each other in a thousand years or more. A fringe object, and yet hiding. All of them in some obscure private generation after generation. It's been displayed publicly. They were part of the same stories, tracing back to the same distant homeland, venerated by ordinary worshippers for centuries. For most of human history, there was no way to check whether that claim was actually true in a biological sense, institutional weight, or whether it was simply a shared set of beliefs. Doubting independently by unrelated groups of people who happen to adopt the same religion for a lot of people all over the world, adopt religions from missionaries, believing in the Shroud's authenticity. To understand why it's never been foolish. It's been a reasonable response to a genuinely strange object held by people who wanted to believe in something bigger than themselves. The point of this video isn't to make anyone feel silly for believing it. It's to walk through what the evidence actually shows, one careful step at a time. But science doesn't stop at, we can't explain it, so it must be supernatural. Researchers have spent decades trying to explain the Shroud using ordinary tools. Chemistry, physics, art history, and now genetics. And several separate lines of evidence, tested independently by different teams who weren't working together, all start pointing the same way. Away from the ancient Middle East and toward medieval Europe. Let's go back to the very first record we have of this object actually existing. It isn't from the 1st century. It isn't even from the Roman era. The earliest solid documentation of the Shroud comes from the 1350s, in a small French village called Lire, where a knight named Geoffroy de Charny had it displayed in a local church. Almost immediately, it caused controversy. Before anyone had the tools, a local bishop, Saint Pierre d'Arcis, wrote a formal letter to the Pope had already noticed small, describing what he learned patterns with decades earlier. Another bishop had investigated the cloth in the 20th century, found the artist who had painted it. Certain rare inherited illnesses letter still exists today. Distinctly higher doesn't prove the Shroud is fake on its own background. Old documents can be population biased right around based on secondhand rumor, almost as if some invisible thread does tell us something patients who had never met. From the very first moment the Shroud enters written history, it was community elders in different countries. There was no unbroken chain of custody when they did occasionally meet Jerusalem and noticed overlapping fragments of medieval France. Melody that immediate suspicion from local clergy and centuries of these observations on their own. The first explanation that researchers tested scientifically was straightforward. Maybe the Shroud really is from the 1st century, and modern science just hasn't caught up without any image was made behind them. In 1988, taken together separate laboratories at Oxford, small, Zurich, half-explained observations built up into a real, given a standing question that historians, doctors, and ordinary families by measuring a specific type of generation after generation at a without no steady rate after something dies. Settle it one way or the other. It's like a biological clock DNA built into every living thing. People reach once you know how fast the clock runs, and each one made a lot of sense to figure out roughly given when the material stopped being alive. First, all 3 labs, working separately so they couldn't influence each other, returned dates in the same range. Somewhere between 1260 and 1390 AD. Not 2,000 years old, about 700. That's not ancient relic. That's medieval Europe, right around the time the Shroud first shows up in those written historical records from Lire. It's worth pausing on just how strong that kind of agreement is. 3 labs, 3 countries, 3 completely separate machines and technicians. None of them knew what the others would find until the results were published together. When independent groups working blind arrive at nearly the same number, that's usually a sign the measurement is solid, not a sign something went wrong. Believers push back, and their pushback deserves to be taken seriously because it wasn't baseless. They argued the tested patch might have come from a repaired section of the cloth, since the shroud had survived a fire in 1532 and been mended afterward with newer thread. It's a fair point. Repairs really can throw off a single sample, because newer thread woven into an old fabric would obviously carbon date younger than the original material around it. But here's where the one bad patch explanation runs into trouble. Later, fiber analysis of the exact tested area found no unusual weave pattern, no mismatched thread type, and no chemical signature suggesting it was a later repair. Was the idea of a purely researchers examined the thread count with no shared direction of the fibers anywhere, and the dye composition theory comparing the tested
Jewish
section
was
to the rest
simply
of
a
the
belief
cloth.
system that
It
spread
matched.
from person
It
to
wasn't a
person
random
and
patch
community
that
to
happened be
community,
wrong.
the same way
It was ordinary
religion
shroud
spreads.
material, tested
The
3
preaching,
times in 3
marriage,
different
and
conversions, with 3
meaning
matching
that a
results.
Jewish community in Yemen,
The second
and a Jewish
explanation
community in
people
Germany
offered was
might be
contamination,
entirely unrelated
the
to
idea
each
that
other by
centuries
blood,
of candle
sharing
smoke,
nothing more than a
handling,
set of
fire
customs
damage,
and
and
a holy
even
text.
coating some medieval
This
textiles
theory made sense
received
too.
could have skewed the
Religions
carbon count.
do spread this way
making
all
a
the time.
genuinely ancient cloth
Christianity and
look
Islam
artificially
both
younger.
spread across continents
This is
through
a real
conversion,
phenomenon in dating
not through
older
one family
families.
multiplying
So
into
scientists
millions of
took
people.
it seriously and
Buddhism
tested
spread
for
from
it
India
directly.
across all of East
Chemists
Asia the same way.
examined the shrouds,
So it was
fibers
entirely
for
reasonable
exactly
for
this kind of
historians to
coding and
ask,
film.
why
Using
would
techniques
Judaism
that
be
can
any
detect
different?
thin residues
Why assume there had
invisible
to be a
the naked
blood
eye
at all when
If
every
heavy
other major
contamination
religion on earth
proves
throwing
that
off the
beliefs
numbers
alone can
you'd
travel
expect it to
across
shift the
oceans and
age
generations
inconsistently across
without
different
any shared
samples.
ancestry behind
Some
them
too young,
whatsoever,
some too old.
The
Since
third
fire
explanation
damage and
was
smoke
the story
residue
of the
don't
10
distribute
lost tribes.
evenly across fabric.
The idea that after
A cloth
ancient Israel
pulled
was
through
conquered
smoke
and its
unevenly
population
dispersed
dispersed
more
roughly
in one corner than
2,700 years ago,
would produce 3
entire
neat
tribes
matching numbers
wandered
from
off
3
into
different
far-flung
labs.
corners of the world.
Instead,
and that
all
many
3
later
labs landed in a
populations,
tight,
sometimes
consistent
located
range.
in extremely unlikely
contamination
places
were
like
driving the result,
Afghanistan, it would have had to
Japan,
affect
parts
3
of
separate
Africa
samples,
might be their
tested in
long-lost
3
descendants.
separate countries, in almost
This
exactly
theory
the
carried
same way,
enormous emotional
which
weight
would be
for
a
many
remarkable
communities,
coincidence.
some
in
of whom
itself.
held their own
It
oral
wasn't
traditions,
uneven and scattered,
claiming exactly
it
this
was
kind of
consistent
ancient
origin,
origin,
passed down for
which is
dozens
usually
of
the
generations,
signature of an
long
accurate
before
measurement,
anyone
not
had
a
a way to
skewed one.
test whether it was true.
There's a third possible
Entire
explanation
communities
worth
built their
mentioning
sense of
honestly,
identity around
even though
this
most
story.
researchers consider it
Some passed
unlikely.
down specific
Could a
family
burst of
names,
ancient radiation,
specific customs,
perhaps
or
from
specific fragments of
resurrection event
ritual
itself,
that they
have altered
believed
the
proved
carbon
the
levels
connection.
in the cloth and thrown
Explorers
off
and
the
missionaries centuries
Some
ago
shroud researchers
wrote home
have
describing
proposed
tribes
versions
they
of this idea
encountered
over the
in remote
years.
mountain regions.
It's not something
who
mainstream
seemed to
science
them
can
to be
test
practicing
directly,
something
since it isn't
that
a
looked
natural,
distantly
repeatable
related to
process.
ancient Israelite customs.
But it's worth naming plainly
None
rather
of
than
this
ignoring.
was invented out of
Because
nowhere.
a fair account
It was
of any
built out
debate
of real
includes the arguments
observations,
people actually
real oral
make.
history, and
What can be
a
said is
genuine,
this:
understandable
nothing
desire
about
to
the
find meaning in a
cloth's
very
chemistry
old and
shows the
very
kind of
painful story
unusual
of exile.
radiation damage you'd
All three
expect from an extreme, unexplained energy event.
The fibers look chemically ordinary for their age. That doesn't disprove the idea outright because it's built to sit outside normal testing, but it does mean there's no physical evidence pointing toward it. Only the absence of evidence against a claim that was never built to be testable in the first place. The fourth explanation is the DNA research speaks to most directly. Maybe the shroud really did wrap one body in one place, and everything else is just later handling. This is where Barkatcha's 2018 genetics study becomes so important, because DNA doesn't lie about geography the way a story can. Her team extracted genetic material from dust and fibers across multiple sections of the cloth and sequenced it. If the shroud had only ever touched one first century's body in one location and had otherwise sat mostly undisturbed, you'd expect the DNA to be dominated by a single geographically narrow signature. Maybe with some later contamination from handlers, but concentrated. What her team found instead was DNA consistent with people connected to a much wider swath of the ancient and medieval world. Signatures linked to populations from the Middle East, but also from Southern Europe, the Caucasus region, and parts of North Africa and Asia. It wasn't one story, it was many people's DNA, layered on top of each other over a long stretch of time in geography. To understand why that matters, it helps to understand what DNA actually is and how it works as a kind of record keeper. DNA is the instruction manual stored in almost every cell of your body. It's made of a long chain of chemical letters in the exact order of those letters is passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, with small changes along the way. Because of that, DNA acts like a genetic paper trail. If you compare DNA from two people or two samples, you can often tell whether they're closely related, distantly related, or from populations that historically lived in completely different parts of the world. There's a specific tool geneticists use for this kind of tracing, called a haplogroup. A haplogroup is like a very old family branch marker, passed down mostly unchanged for thousands of years along one line. For mitochondrial DNA, that's the mother's line, since mitochondrial DNA is handed down almost only from mother to child, generation after generation, without mixing with the father's DNA. Think of it like a last name that only mothers pass on, staying mostly the same for centuries at a time, because certain haplogroups became common in certain regions over thousands of years. Finding a particular haplogroup in a sample can point researchers toward where that person's ancestors likely lived. When Barcaccia's team looked at the Shroud's DNA, they didn't find one dominant haplogroup pattern. They found several, linked to different regions. That's the genetic equivalent of finding a dozen different last names on one guest book instead of one family's name repeated over and over. Certain small variations in DNA are especially common in some regions and rare in others, not because of anything mystical, but simply because people who lived and had children in the same region for generations tend to share more genetic similarities with each other than with people who lived somewhere far away. Scientists call this general pattern population structure, and it's one of the most well-established tools in modern genetics. It's the same basic principle behind consumer ancestry tests that tell people their DNA is 40% this region, 30% that region. When scientists find a mix of DNA linked to many different regions in one place, the simplest explanation isn't usually one extraordinary event. It's many ordinary people passed through here. That's exactly the pattern the Shroud's DNA shows. And once you know the object's real history, the pattern makes a lot more sense. This isn't a cloth that sat sealed in a tomb for 2,000 years. It's a cloth that was carried across Europe and the Middle East during the age of the Crusades and pilgrimage relics, displayed in churches, touched by worshippers, kissed, wept over, carried through processions, handled by clergy, restorers, and craftsmen for roughly 7 centuries that we can actually document. Every one of those hands, every one of those pilgrims, could have left behind traces of their own DNA, skin cells, sweat, even tiny amounts of blood from a bleeding hand or a scraped knuckle. Multiply that by hundreds of years and thousands of people from many different regions who traveled to see it, and a mixed, geographically scattered DNA profile isn't a mystery anymore. It's exactly what you'd expect. It helps to understand just how much traveling this specific object actually did, because it wasn't kept quietly in one chapel the whole time. After its appearance in Lirey in the 1350s, it passed through the hands of the House of Savoy, a powerful noble family who moved it multiple times over the following century, to Chambéry, in what's now eastern France, where it survived that fire in 1532 that scorched its edges and left visible burn marks still on the cloth today. From there, it eventually made the journey over the Alps into Italy, finally settling in Turin in 1578, the city it's named after and still housed in. Along the way, it was displayed publicly at multiple stops, drawing crowds of pilgrims at each one. This wasn't a sealed artifact in a vault. It was, for long stretches of its documented history, a traveling object that ordinary people lined up to see, touch, and sometimes even briefly hold. To make this less abstract, it helps to think about one specific kind of person who might have left a trace behind. Not a famous name, because history didn't record individual pilgrims by name, but a very real category of person nonetheless. Picture a woman in the 1400s, a wool merchant's wife from a small town in what's now eastern France, walking for days to reach the church at Lirey, where the Shroud was first put on public display. She's heard stories about the cloth from a traveling preacher. She's saved a little money, packed simple food for the journey, and walked with a group from her parish because travel alone was dangerous. When she finally reaches the front of the crowd and is allowed to kneel close enough to touch the edge of the linen, her hands are cracked from wool work, maybe bleeding slightly at the knuckle from the cold and the labor. She presses her palm to the cloth for a moment, prays, and moves on, never imagining that 600 years later, a laboratory machine would be able to detect the faint genetic trace she left behind. She's not a saint, not a scientist, not a name in any history book. She's simply one of thousands of ordinary people whose lives brushed up against this object, and without meaning to, became part of its physical record. She wasn't alone, either. Picture a monk, 2 centuries later, tasked with folding and storing the cloth after a public showing, his hands damp with sweat from the summer heat, carefully creasing linen that had already been folded and unfolded hundreds of times before him. Picture a royal attendant during the House of Savoy's ownership, carrying the Shroud in its reliquary box during one of its moves between cities, jostled by a cartwheel hitting a rut in the road, briefly touching the fabric to keep it from shifting. None of these people thought of themselves as leaving evidence behind. They were just doing their jobs, living their lives, participating in a tradition much bigger than themselves. But that's precisely how a genetic record like this one gets built. Not through one dramatic event, but through thousands of small, unremarkable human moments, stacked on top of each other for centuries. None of this rests on a single test either, which is important because a single result can always be dismissed as a fluke, a bad sample, or a lab error. What makes the medieval origin explanation strong isn't just one study. It's that the radiocarbon dating, the fiber and weave analysis, the art historical record showing exactly when the shroud enters written history. And now the DNA evidence all independently arrive at the same conclusion. There's more. Supporting evidence beyond even those. Pollen analysis is one example. Researchers have examined pollen grains trapped in the cloth's fibers over the decades, since pollen is remarkably durable and can survive for centuries, carrying its own kind of geographic fingerprint based on which plants it came from. Some of that pollen research has been contested and is less conclusive than the DNA and dating work, and it's fair to say scientists don't fully agree on what it proves. But even setting the pollen debate aside, the core evidence, carbon dating from 3 independent labs, fiber analysis, the documented history starting in the 1950s, and the DNA study was run by different teams using completely different methods, decades apart from each other, and none of them were trying to confirm the other's results in advance. When multiple independent lines of evidence using entirely different scientific techniques all converge on the same window of time and the same pattern of widespread human contact, that's not coincidence. That's what real evidence looks like when it's telling the truth. It's also worth addressing directly the question a lot of people have in the back of their minds while watching all of this. If the shroud isn't a first-century burial cloth, how was the image itself created? This part remains genuinely, honestly unresolved, and it's important, not to pretend otherwise. Researchers have proposed a range of ideas: a medieval imaging technique using early photographic principles, a contact transfer process using natural substances, or an artistic method not yet fully understood. Some researchers have tried to recreate similar image effects using medieval-era materials and techniques, with partial success, but no single reproduction has perfectly matched every characteristic of the original. That gap, the fact that we understand the age and the travel history far better than we understand the exact image-forming process, is a genuinely open scientific question, and honest scientists on both sides of the authenticity debate will tell you the same thing. It's one of the most striking parts of this whole story. We can be far more confident about when the shroud was made than about how the image itself got there. Step back from the shroud itself, and there's a bigger idea sitting underneath all of this. We want our sacred objects, our family heirlooms, our national relics, to hold one clean, simple story. One origin, one owner, one unbroken line back to the beginning. It's comforting to believe that. It gives a messy, complicated past a single, tidy thread to follow. But DNA, again and again, tells us something different about almost everything humans touch and pass down. That the true story is almost never one line. It's layers. It's countless people, most of them unnamed and forgotten, each adding a small, invisible trace to something that outlives all of them individually. This isn't unique to the shroud either. It's a pattern that shows up again and again when scientists apply genetic testing to old objects and old family stories. Consumer ancestry tests routinely reveal that a family's "we've always been from this one country" story is actually a mix of regions, quietly built up over generations of migration, marriage, and movement that nobody kept written records of. Old churches and burial sites, when tested, often reveal congregations and communities far more genetically diverse than local legend remembered. Heirlooms passed down as belonging to one family line sometimes carry genetic traces, showing they passed through far more hands and far more different households than any family story accounted for. The shroud is a particularly dramatic, particularly well-documented example of something that's actually a very common finding. Our objects remember more people than our stories do. The shroud isn't less remarkable because it turned out to be medieval instead of ancient. If anything, it's more remarkable, a genuine 700-year record of human devotion, written not in ink, but in the DNA of everyone who ever reached out and touched it. Every hand that pressed against that linen, believing in something bigger than themselves, left behind a tiny, permanent trace of who they were. That's not a lesser story than the one people originally believed. In some ways, it's a more human one. Proof not of a single miraculous moment, but of centuries of ordinary people showing up again and again, carrying their faith, their hope, their grief, and their DNA with them. So here's the question worth sitting with. If a single piece of cloth can quietly hold the genetic fingerprints of people from a dozen different countries and centuries, what other objects sitting in museums, churches, or your own family's attic might be carrying a hidden human history nobody's ever tested for? Tell me in the comments which relic, ancestry mystery, or cursed family heirloom you want investigated next. I rate every single one, and a lot of future topics start right there. And if this is the kind of story where science quietly rewrites what we thought we knew, subscribe. Because next time, we're tracing a DNA mystery hiding in something even more unexpected than an old piece of linen.